What a way to start off the week as we talk about ancient texts with somebody who really knows. His name is Howard West. Here on in, we'll just call him West on Coast to Coast AM. Howard West, he's a jack of all trades, though he's a master of one, that of unraveling ancient texts, parables, and the mysteries hidden within. He has found two ancient texts that he says were written by three men that have been dated 12,500 years ago. Those texts were datable by the star charts hidden within the parables of the text. Also hidden in those texts was the means to keep those texts accurate for more than 12,000 years. Howard has a varied career, from programming computers to traveling 6,000 miles at 2 miles an hour with his wife behind 6 little burros. Howard is also the author of Quicksilver Key, and through that book, he hopes to share the mysteries of the ancients, from alchemy to how the Great Pyramids were built. He's our special guest tonight on Coast to Coast. First-time guest, Howard, right?
That's right.
Well, welcome to the program. Good to have you with us.
Well, thank you, George. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time.
So you want us to call you West?
Yeah, that's kind of, I like that name.
Well,
so you know how it is when you were a kid and you were bad? And your mom would call you by your whole name. You ever have that happen to you?
No, I was a pretty good kid.
Well, I was. So I have a tendency to like my last name as a nickname. So if you could do that for me, I appreciate it.
You have no problems here. Of course, my mom always used to call me Georgie, but I prefer George. So I guess I can understand.
Okay, I won't call you Georgie.
You got a deal.
Okay.
Hey, tell me a little bit about yourself beyond just what the bio said.
Oh, well, like I said in the bio, I'm a kind of a jack of all trades. I live up in the hills in the middle of Nevada. My closest neighbors actually are Groom Lake, and I have aircraft flying over the top of my house at about 600 feet, and they're screaming across with high-speed aircraft doing Mach 1, so it has a tendency to shake the roof every once in a while.
I would guess so. So, but tell me your interest in these ancient texts. I mean, how did this all happen?
Well, over the years, I was able to get interested in these ancient texts. I am a Christian, by the way,
right.
And so one of the things that you do if you're a really good Christian is you go out and study to show yourself approved. So I started doing the traditional ones, and then I found some really unique scriptures and really unique books that everybody had forgotten about. In fact, one of those books had been lost for 1,500 years. So I went through and I started studying it, and I found some really neat little statements in there that no one had ever seen before. One of the words in a ancient star text was the word Yane. And you say, what's a Yane?
Yane?
Yane. Well, what that word means in Arabic is Polaris. And going through and taking that information, I found out that one time, 12,500 years ago, that star Yane was in a parallel pattern with the sun, the moon, across the daytime sky, one time, June 10,500 years before Christ, for about 500 years. In the month of June, when the new moon was coming up, it was running alongside the sun and the new moon across the daytime sky. So I went and I checked that out, and I went to a local planetarium, and I asked the planetarium supervisor there to put it up onto his computer. And I boggled his mind because I told him exactly where those stars were going to be. And the only way to be able to figure that out now is to have a computer to be able to run the stars backwards.
Did he think you had already done that?
No, he was, how should I put it? He was surprised, but he wasn't all that amazed because I told him where it was going to be. The thing is, it wasn't just in one text. It was in two texts that actually dated to that same time period. Because of that, I was able to trace other things that happened exactly during that time period, which were told in the books. And the only way that that could be found out is if you were there when it happened.
These three men that you say wrote these texts, who might they have been?
Well, the Ethiopic name of one of the men was called Pa-Henok. Then his great-great-grandson wrote the other half of the book. And then a common name that you may have heard in your childhood and when you went to church, the man's name was Job.
Ah, yes.
You remember, I've heard several of your guests go out and talk about the subtle movements of the Pleiades. In that particular portion of that book of Job, there is another little phrase in there that if you go back to the original Hebrew, and when I say back to the original Hebrew, I'm not talking about the Masoretic text. See, the Masoretic text, they went out and they added vowel signs to the actual text. Because before that, they just had the consonants. And so several different words could have been used for the same statement. When the Masoretics came in, this was after the Christian church had started, they put different vowel signs in to make it easier for them to keep a consistent doctrine on their particular church, on their particular organization.
All right. The dating of these texts, which you say are, roughly 12,500 years ago, 10,000 plus years BC, what did they talk about in terms of events that were occurring?
Oh, they talked about a certain group of entities that had came down and that had given them certain pieces of information. For an example, one of the fellows that had came down, he gave them the ability to have a written language. Another fellow that came down gave them things like swords and shields and makeup and mirrors. The key to the whole thing that I just gave you was the written language and the mirrors.
And the mirror. What's the significance of the mirror?
Well, at that time, it was a long walk to get from point A to point B. So what they were able to do is they would take a piece of copper and polish it up nice and bright, and then they would use a liquid metal, Quicksilver, the name of my book, Quicksilver P. That Quicksilver would act like, have you ever soldered a connection with a soldering iron?
I sure have.
And have that lead get all nice and liquidy.
Shiny.
And then it touches that copper and it adheres to that copper. It's called amalgam. The difference between lead and mercury is that mercury is already in a liquid form. When it hits the copper, it turns that bright, shiny color and turns that piece of copper into a mirror in about 30 seconds. With a mirror, what they would do, as you know, that when sunlight will reflect off a mirror, and you can redirect that sunlight. So what those fellas did is they were able to use that to redirect the light from mountaintop to mountaintop. And at that point, they would use a eyelid. I'll call it an eyelid for a reason a little bit later, to blink similar to what's called a Morse code, where a dot dash type of program.
So it was for communication purposes.
Absolutely. And because of the ability to have communication. Now, for an example, I'm going to go a little bit further ahead in time to a time in the last century here in the United States. We had a war with the Apaches. And the Apaches had gone out and they had started cutting the telegraph wires. So we didn't have as fast communications as we should have had.
Right.
What they ended up doing is General Miles went out and put together what is called a heliograph system. What that was a mirrored system. It had two mirrors that they were able to take the light's reflection from the sun, direct it onto a mirror, and then take another mirror and redirect that to the location where the troops were, and be able to send a Morse code message to the troops, letting them know where the enemy was at and what the enemy was doing.
And I bet that was over miles, wasn't it?
That was over miles. That was a very good pun there. And his General Miles went out and he negotiated with Cochise. And he said, we've got a great communication system. And he told them about steam and a few other odds and ends. And he says, and we have the heliograph. Well, Cochise said, yes, I have seen the blinks of lights on the mountains, and we thought they were gods. So what Miles did is he sent a message hundreds of miles away where Cochise's brother was at. And at that point, they received the message back in just a matter of hours that would have taken 20 days for a man on a fast pony to get there. When Cochise got that message, he sent one of his riders to Natchez and says, Natchez, get down here to surrender because there's something here I don't understand, and I need you here because we can't win. The thing is, that same principle went all the way back to 12,000 years ago.
Now, the individuals who brought this gift in series of items down to us, were they the same ones depicted in the Sumerian texts that Zecharia Sitchin has written about?
Yes, they were, but I'm going to plead ignorance. I've never read Zecharia Sitchin, so I don't know all of the different things in the Sumerian text.
Well, which is going to make this even more remarkable tonight, West, because you will give us a different perspective on events that are being substantiated by other sources as well, and that's important.
I always believe if you haven't got at least 6 different cross-references, you haven't done your homework.
Okay, so these texts, where are they now physically?
Oh, well, one of the original texts is at when I say original, I'll get to that aspect of it in a little bit. They are in one came from Qumran Cave 4. That's in in Israel near the Dead Sea, and then it had been brought back to Jerusalem, and it's in one of their museums at this point.
Was this part of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Absolutely, that was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to 200 years before Christ.
All right. Now,
one of the things with these texts is in the Hebrew language, they would have a alphanumeric code, and what that meant was every letter had a code. So the first letter of the alphabet would be 1, and then it would go down the list until it got to 10. Then it would jump from 10 to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 200. And it would go down through the alphabetic code with that numeric value. Then they had a really unique way of making sure that the texts were accurate over the thousands of years that the texts were being written down. They would put in a line cipher. What a line cipher is a little code that tells you what the message totals up to be. So, for an example, I'll give you a cute one. In the book of Isaiah, the 19th chapter, in the 19th and 20th verse, they have a total as of what those two verses are. It just happens to be the description of the Great Pyramid. And the grand total of those two scriptures happens to be the exact height in inches, which was the measurement that the Egyptians used to verify the length of how big something was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
The exact measurement from the base of the pyramid to the platform in exact inches. That's how precise they were with keeping their text. Now, going back to that blinker code that we were talking about a little bit earlier, there are several different groups that use that particular code. The cuneiform, or it's pronounced a little bit differently than that, but it was basically little triangles or wedge form that they would put into clay to be able to make sure that you could understand what was being written. The thing is, that was it was not an alphanumeric code, but it was a blinker code. What they would do is, for an example, they'd put a little triangle into the clay with their tool.
Mm-hmm.
If it was just the triangle and it was going to the right, it was a dot, equivalent to the Morse code dot used for the letter E. It wasn't the letter E, but it would be equivalent to that. Then they had another little triangular shape with a little extension on it, and it was going the opposite direction. That would be equivalent to our Morse code, the letter T, a short dash. Then they have a little line that goes up and down, and what that was a long dash, as in the letter L for the Morse code. They were able to utilize that dot-dash system to be able to transmit the messages between watchtowers from one area to the next. In fact, the fall of Troy was actually told to the, she wasn't the best little gal in the world. She was Agamemnon's wife. She was the sister-in-law to Helen in the fall of Troy. Well, she wanted to make sure she knew when her husband was coming home because she was running around on it.
She wanted a little head start, right?
She wanted a little head start. And what happened is they actually, one of the ancient stories, it was called Agamemnon, it was a play that was written, said that she knew when the fall of Troy happened because of the beacon lights between Troy and Mycenae. They had the code system, so she knew the day that the fall of Troy happened, so she knew when her husband was coming home.
And obviously the beacon of light was occurring during the daytime because they were using just the sun then to transmit this, right?
I'm a little flexible on that. You could do a daytime or a nighttime.
Could you use moonlight to do that?
It depends on how big your mirror was. The reason why is because you've reduced your actual amount of sun, so your amount of light. So the less light that you have, the more surface area you have to have reflecting the light. Now, the problem is with the moon is that, believe it or not, most of the time it's not there at night because you've got your new moon period.
Right.
And then you've got every single day your moon is coming up 42 minutes later.
Stay with us, Wes. We're going to talk with you more about this when we come back. And I'm very interested to get your take on these beings that apparently gave this knowledge to human beings. We'll talk about that when we come back. And again, a tremendous offer for you to subscribe to the After Dark newsletter. You will get a double CD of an Art Bell interview, series of interviews with the late Father Malachi Martin. We have found another one of them, and we're going to give it to you when you subscribe to the After Dark newsletter by calling 1-888-727-5505 or go online at coasttocoastam.com. You remind me, West, of a cross between an archaeologist professor and Mr. Rogers. You even have that kind of tone and inflection. Anybody ever tell you that?
Sometimes I get called Professor, yeah. But never Mr. Rogers.
You've got that Mr. Rogers feel. I feel like you've invited us into your home.
Well, that's good. That's really what I want to do, is I want everybody to feel comfortable and have a lot of fun. And you can do that when you're at a friend's home.
You know, there's so much to talk with you about with all this, but I want to get into also the discussion of this visitation, these extraterrestrials. Was it in the texts directly? Did you find that someplace else? How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, the thing is every single country, not when I say country, I should say every single ethnic group has memory traces of these folks. And they have different names. For an example, one of those fellas, his name in Babylon was Nabu, and the same fella in China was Fuhi, and in Egypt he was Thoth. And every single country had a different name for him. The Semitic language, he was Hermes or Hermes. And then we have the Greeks called him Hermes, and he was also known as Apollo. And then the piece de la resistance is the Romans called him Mercury, Quicksilver.
Interesting. Very fascinating.
One of the things that he did is he gave the written language to each and every one of those groups. Even to the Aztecs, he was the same fella. Not only that, he was the same fella that gave alchemy to all those groups.
Did they discuss how he traveled from spot to spot?
They didn't go into too much detail. The reason why is that memory trace came from one text, and then as the people spread out from where that text was, they kept it as a memory trace. So they didn't necessarily know how he traveled. In fact, we don't know how he got from his extraterrestrial location to this planet, but we do know that he didn't come from here. That same fella has a planet named after him, and that planet's name is Mercury. His associate, he was the number 2 man. There was 200 of them that came. He was the number 2 man. The number 1 man was known as Thor. He was also known as the blacksmith. He was known as Azrael, and then he was also known as Lucifer.
Oh, my. So Thor and Lucifer may be one and the same?
May be one and the same, but they don't. Anytime you have a story, if it's written down, it has a tendency to stay a little bit more accurate. When it is verbalized, you have a tendency to add a little bit here, subtract a little bit there, scare your kids a little bit this way with a little bit extra in the story. But the general flavor always stays. That particular entity has, like I said, he has certain characteristics. Primarily, that entity was the blacksmith. He gave the abilities to do the metal work. In fact, he taught man how to work with stone. And in a little bit, I'll tell you how he helped to make it easy to build the pyramids with copper tools.
Are you going to give us a theory that we haven't heard yet?
Oh, I should think so.
All right.
The nice thing about this particular entity is that he did give us some really good things. One of the other 200, a fellow by the name of Tabet, he was known for a different reason. He was the first one to make abortions actually have one of those fellows, and that's what his claim to fame was.
And they talk about that in texts as well?
They talked about that in the text.
Then that is bizarre.
It is bizarre, isn't it? The thing is these entities had the ability to go out and do a lot of nasty things. They were not the sweethearts that we sometimes think the extraterrestrials or the negative, the non-human beings that are in the world. The Christians call them Lucifer, the devil,
fallen angels.
Fallen angels. The thing is when these entities came to Earth, they actually bred with the local women. And
sounds like Genesis now.
Sounds like Genesis. Well, what happened is these entities that when they came down, they were immortal. They weren't the type of people that we are. They did not die. But when they had a child with a normal woman, that child was not immortal in his flesh. He was immortal in his spirit. After a period of time, these children of the, we'll just call them the dissidents, they became kind of large, and they got hungry. And
you mean like giants?
Like giants. And these, we'll call them giants. These giants would go out, and it took all the time of the non-giants to go out and feed these critters. The problem is eventually they got to the point where they didn't have sufficient supplies, and these entities became cannibals. At that point, the locals started to dispatch these particular entities. The only problem is when these entities were dispatched, their spirits didn't die. Their spirits didn't go to hell, but they were let loose in the spirit realm.
Now, and what do you mean by dispatched?
Killed.
Ah.
These were flesh and blood entities, but unlike mankind, which they were half man and half the separate entity, they were, how should I put it? They weren't from here. And because of that, their spirits did not have a resting place. They have many names for them throughout history. We can call them risen masters. We can call them familiar spirits. We can call them demons. We can call them the Greys. We can call them shadow people. These entities are all around us. And have you ever, once in a while, you got real depressed and something was going on and everything wasn't going right for you, and the next thing you know, you're saying stuff that you really didn't want to say. You said a curse word that you didn't think that normally you'd say, but all of a sudden it came out of your mouth. You ever had that happen to you?
Not me, West. I'm as close to sainthood as you can get.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad to hear that. That's one.
You believe that?
Okay. But what happens is these entities have the ability to whisper into our little ears and make us think that that's what we're thinking. That entity can only be controlled by a certain power, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
All right. Did you say there were 200 of them that had come down to our planet?
200.
Did they all come down together?
No. Basically, the blacksmith came down first, and then there was the rest of them came down. But then there was a big problem on where they came from. But I'd like to get to that a little bit later.
Where they came from?
Uh-huh.
You mean like a planet?
Mm-hmm. You see, their planet had a big problem because these entities were not the good guys. And they had a destruction of their planet. And it's a little bit early in the conversation to go there, if you don't mind.
Sounds like Superman, though.
Believe it or not, when you go into the Superman movie, actually, you remember when Superman came down and Lex Luthor was going to divide the America for a profit?
Right.
That's actually out of Daniel chapter 11. The Antichrist will divide the lands for profit.
But remember how Superman's planet blew up?
Mm-hmm. These folks' planet didn't blow up. It was more of a, how should I put it, a decompression.
Was this planet in our solar system, or was it outside of it?
It was next door in our solar system.
In our solar system. So this would have been the extra planet, maybe, that we've heard so much about?
No, it was actually the red planet next door.
Mars?
That's it.
Well, that's an interesting theory, West.
But we'll get to that in a little bit. What I'd like to do is give you some insights into that stonemason, the blacksmith.
The first one that came down?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, why?
Well, he had a son, and the name of his son was Khufu.
Khufu. From Egypt, Khufu?
Egypt. That
All right.
was his son. And if you remember your history, Khufu had two claims to fame. His first claim to fame was he built the pyramid. His second claim to fame was that he was able to control the annual flood of the Nile.
Well, you'd be able to do that. You're a pretty powerful individual.
Well, a fellow by the name of Nasser went out and did it in the late 50s. It's called Aswan Dam. And that's exactly how Khufu controlled the annual flooding of the Nile.
Now, when you say that he was part of the construction of the pyramids, that he was the one who orchestrated it, there's been some debate over how the pyramids were made. You have some thoughts on that?
Well, there's basically the common thought is that they pushed them up a ramp. Now, basically what they figured out, and there was several different people that I'm not going to go into the details on who they are. They're detailed in the book. But basically they did a mathematical calculations, and they said that if they were going to push one of these blocks up a grade, they could push it up only a grade of 1 foot up to every foot of linear movement. So if we have a pyramid that's almost 500 feet long, you've got almost a mile long ramp going up, which is about 8 million cubic yards of material.
And that's only for one spot, right?
That's correct. Now, if they had 4 ramps, that would be 32 million cubic yards of material to be able to put 4 ramps up. The only problem, have you ever tried to push a car in sand?
It doesn't happen, West. You can't do it.
That was one of the problems. They had to come up with an extremely hard surface. But the problem is that that's an awful lot of work. And according to Herodotus, they did it in 20 years. To do that, they would have to push 1 block from the bottom to the level of construction every 90 seconds.
There's no way.
There's no way.
Not conventionally.
Now, there's another theory out there, and that's the spiral ramp theory, where you would have a ramp system that would curl around the pyramid, and eventually you would get up to the top. The only problem with that is, well, many problems, but the major problem with that is that they would be using rollers. Rollers are not like your car. They don't turn real sharp. And as they would push them up these ramps, they would have to make a 90-degree turn to be able to get to the next switchback. The problem with that is that more likely than not, instead of them making their turn, it would tumble off the side of the sea. So that's not a real good way of going about it. Then there's the floating them on air, which is a kind of a neat concept, isn't it?
Yes, if it can be done.
Well, there's a fella that built the Coral Castle.
Yes, Edward Leeds Scullin.
Right. And one of your guests, a very good friend of yours, mentioned that he saw what he perceived to be a generator in a picture, indicating that it might be something electrical.
Right.
I looked at the same picture, and I saw a pneumatic device that was utilized to be able to lift those stones up with air. The only problem is that it wasn't the same way that you might think. Have you ever gone and seen in the newspaper where some fool went out and drove his semi-truck into a bridge that his truck was too tall for, and they couldn't get the truck out?
That's been known to happen.
Well, what they have to do is they let the air out of the tires, and that makes the tires all go flat. And then they can back the truck out. Then what they do, and most of those trucks in this area will haul 80,000 pounds. Then what they do is they take a compressor and they put air back in the tires. Next thing you know, that truck has now gained almost 6 to 10 inches by floating on air that are in tires.
I see what you mean.
Now, if you go out and you have a system of tires and you're able to have them axled, you can go out and you can pull your stone off the back of the pickup, off the truck, onto a wheeled device that you can deflate your tires or inflate your tires. You shim your device when you get to the location that you want it to be. You shim up your block in your little wheeled vehicle. You deflate the tires, and then you compress those tires and shim underneath those tires. And then you reinflate the tires. Now you've just lifted it another 6 inches.
But we're talking about huge blocks here, West.
Bigger than 80,000 pounds.
So how do they float it?
They actually are basically using the tires to contain the air instead of having them outside, having the air float them. They're actually floating them on air that is actually in the tire. Just like when you have a flat and you pump up your tire, you lift the weight. In my little book, I go into several different phases of how that's done rather than trying to visualize every single step. But basically, it's real simple, just by putting a little air in the tire.
That's an interesting theory. Stay with us. I want to talk about Mars when we come back on Coast to Coast AM. And our guest tonight, West, he's the author of Quicksilver Key, fascinating book about going way back into ancient texts. We'll talk with him a little bit more about that and also get into his theories on Mars in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, West, you were talking about some of the texts were, the Dead Sea Scroll versions 200 BC. What about these other ones, though, the ones that go way back? Where are they? How did you find them?
Okay. Well, one of the things is that when the texts were written, they were a Semitic text. All of the Middle Eastern languages used a alphanumeric code. Now, with the Semitic texts, when they would go and they would write something down, as I mentioned earlier, they would go out and they would copy it from an older text. As the text became more and more mature, those texts would be put into a cave and buried, because the new text, because of the alphanumeric code system, was more accurate than the original, the text that it was copied from, because there would be smears in the text, pieces of ink would be chipped away, and things like that. So the actual text, even though it was not the oldest text, was actually considered the more accurate text. So when we have those texts brought through the generation, we find that there are pieces of information that were only available to those people during that time period. When they date ancient texts, what they sometimes do is they say, well, this particular event happened, and this particular text mentions that event. It could be a comet, it could be a war, it could be a flood, it could be a lot of different things. That's what they utilize to date a text. The thing is once a text is dated, the sky and the stars have to move before that text can be redated. The thing is that's exactly what happened with the text that the Pahenach text and the Job text happened. See, the stars that we see today are in a particular location. As the progression of the equinox changes our North Star, the sky actually moves around, the gentle movements of the Pleiades. Now, the circle of that progression, on one side of that circle is Polaris, where we are right now. On the opposite side is a star named Vega. Now, what happens is it goes out and it's like a
by the way, isn't that the star system Jodie Foster went to in the movie Contact? Wasn't it the Vega system? I think it was.
You could be right. Like I said, I don't have a TV, and I haven't went to a movie in 15 years.
Wow, West.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, but the thing is because of that, we don't have the oldest text, because they were actually, when the older copies were put away into those caves and stuff, the oldest one we have is actually from Qumran, which they have dated 200 years before Christ.
Right.
But the actual concept of keeping it accurate. In fact, have you ever had your computer crash on you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and when you turn it back on, you'll notice on your screen that a little line is moving across. And what is actually happening is each line of text, each line of code, has that line cipher, just like the ancient text did. And when the computer goes through and it says, oops, this line is not correct, then it says we need to reboot that particular aspect of the program. We use that same concept in our computers, and NASA uses that same concept in their computers to make sure that the program or the text stays accurate, rather than having it garbage in, garbage out.
You've made reference of the Watchers.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the Watchers? What are the Watchers?
Well, right now, the Watchers were a group of entities, and George, you're making me feel real bad. You let me explain the way not to build the pyramid, but you didn't let me explain the way to build the pyramid. And I'm bad. I'm going to ask you, if you pretty please, do that question that you had just asked me after I tell you how the pyramids were built.
No, I want to know about the Watchers first. We'll get back to the pyramids.
Okay. Now, basically what happened is a very long time ago, there was a entity that came he was called in one of the texts a black bull. They use parables. What a parable is the word parable means hidden inside the container. Most of us go out and we see a parable and we think it's an allegory. An allegory is a way to give you a concept of good and evil, whereas a parable is a story that has a truth hidden within. Now, in the text, it talks about this entity coming down, and they call him cow. And actually, they call him a bull. And he comes in, and he starts interbreeding with, and this is in the parable form, with the planet, the people here on our planet. Okay. Well, what happened was eventually some other fellows came down at that same time, the 200. Now, because they were interbreeding with the humans at that time, and again, the offspring after it dies is called the demon, they were punished. And the text says that they were punished by being stoned, not having too much marijuana, but actually being crushed with rocks. Now, the Nebuchadnezzar wrote a story, and it was called the, paraphrasing it, basically the story of the travels of Venus. Now, what the text said is at one time, Venus was in an elliptical orbit outside of the plane of the ecliptic, above the plane of the ecliptic, and out into the outer areas of space, more or less like a comet. Like
almost like Velikovsky's theory that Venus was a captured comet.
Mm-hmm. Now, believe it or not, in Isaiah, he actually explains that very thing. In Isaiah, he talks about Lucifer. Remember that Lucifer was also known as the light bearer, also known as Venus. You go into that particular chapter in Isaiah, and it talks about the destruction that happened because of Venus. In fact, at one time, Venus came very close to planet Earth. And at that point, we had a portion of our atmosphere ripped off about, I think it was 26 million years ago. As that planet came, as the Venus came by, it came close enough that it decompressed a certain portion of our atmosphere. And actually, our sea levels dropped by 1,000 feet. And they don't know where all that water went. If they took that 1,000 feet of sea level drop and turned it into snow, 1 inch of water makes approximately 14 inches of snow. If you do the math, you would have 1.6 miles of snow over the entire planet. If all you have is snow, you don't have any grass. And if you don't have any grass, you don't have
almost
any
like
animals.
a planetary ice age. Everything would be gone.
But the thing is what actually happened, it was a decompression, where a certain amount of the CO2 and the water was actually ripped off the planet. They have gone out and they've done core drilling down into the seabed, and they have found that actually happened. They assumed that it was turned into ice because everything stays the same as far as certain scientists feel. But what actually happened is a similar thing happened to the planet Mars. What the ancient text speaks of is that Mars and Venus were in Mars and Venus in ancient history, in the Greek text, they didn't get along too well, but they did have 2 children. But what happened was, remember, there's tidal bulges on the Mars. There's a theory out there that there is an additional planet out there that was given to cause that tidal bulge. What the ancient text says is that actually what it was our moon was in a orbit, synchronous orbit around Mars. When the Venus came through, it came above the plane of the ecliptic over the northern portion of Mars. At that point, it caused a decompression of the planet, which caused the atmosphere and the water to be boiled off of the planet. As it passed by, it caught not only the water that was decompressed from the planet, it got a hold of that moon, and it brought it with it in its gravitational wake. Now, throughout history, there's different names for that particular, we'll call it an entity, the moon and the waters from Mars. In China, that particular entity is called the Azure Dragon. In the Book of Pahenok, it's called Leviathan. Each of these different countries had a different name for that particular conglomeration of the planet, of our moon, and the waters that came off of that planet.
But similar stories.
They go from, for an example, in South America, the down in Tierra del Fuego, down at the very bottom of the South America, they have a legend that said that one of their gods had a wife, and she was not very nice, and she decided that she was going to destroy planet Earth with a flood. And so this god turned his wife into the moon. We also have another story that talks about that same thing in Babylon, where one of their mother gods was the moon, and she caused the flood. Another story in Colombia, same basic story. And then here's something that you may not have known. Remember when God said in Genesis that he would put a bow in the sky as a sign of covenant? Remember that in Genesis?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He did that on the very first day of the month of the new year of the very first year after the flood. The very first day of the month, remember we have just had a Muslim
Ramadan.
There, that date that the starting of Ramadan is started the day that the flood ended, and the shape of the moon on the very first day of the month is a crescent moon, a bow in the sky. Genesis says the same thing. On the first day of the month, there was a bow in the clouds, which was a crescent moon.
What's so fascinating about this is how celestial events have really interpreted, mythology throughout the history of mankind.
And that's one of the ways that that the texts were kept accurate. For an example, in the pyramid, there is a tunnel that goes up, and I call it the bottomless pit, or the descending passage. If you went down that on 2141 September before Christ, 2141 before Christ, and you're walking down that tunnel on the September 21st at noon, you're walking down that tunnel. That tunnel is so long and so precisely laid out that when you get about three-quarters of the way down, at one time there was a pool of water down below in the bottom. And eventually you'd walk down that, and all of a sudden you would see the reflection of a star in the water at the bottom of that tunnel. When you turned around, you would see through that dark tunnel that same star up in the sky, 2141. Thuman was visible during the daytime because of what is called the tunnel or the pipe effect, which allows you, if you have a long enough pipe and it is straight enough, to actually block out the ambient light of daytime and see the stars during the daytime. Now, if you follow that back up, and if it has to be during the nighttime when you follow it back up, you'll see a star picture up in the sky. That star picture that is connected to Thuman is Dracos, the snake. Now, Dracos is encircling the other star pictures that are in the sky above us in the north. But there's one star picture that Dracos could not overcome. And if you look at him, he is called the strong man. Some people call him Hercules. His foot is on the head of that snake, and he is taking a club in the shape of a cross, and he is beating that snake. In Genesis, it says, and the seed of the woman shall bruise your head, snake, and you shall bruise his heel. They actually took a star picture pattern, and in Genesis, they incorporated that into the prophecy of the future Christ coming.
Wes, the book Quicksilver Key, where do you get it? Where do people find it?
We have it, right now, we have it on our website, which is classicnevada.com. And we also, you can mail order it from us at P.O. Box 9818, Reno, Nevada, 89507. And it's $13.95 plus. I don't think there's tax. If you want to send it, we'll send it out there, including delivery.
Well, you know what's fascinating about your theory is that it echoes, with you not really being aware of some other people that have been out there, some of the things that they have said. There's no question in my mind that something happened to this planet in its inception, that mankind was affected by probable visitation and probably genetically altered. Just amazing. Wes, thanks for being on Coast to Coast. Appreciate it. We've got an important update from Richard C. Hoagland in just a moment about that head on the moon. What a transition right into that. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, we'll have open lines for the entire hour, so get ready for that. But in a moment, remember, Richard C. Hoagland, when he came back from Joshua Tree, showed us at Joshua Tree an incredible photograph. Well, we had Richard talk about it on Monday of last week, just about this whole episode. In a moment, an update on that head on the moon. Coast to Coast AM. Well, as you know, here at Coast to Coast, we have what we call the floating format, which means at any given time we will change the direction of the show if there's breaking news or a major story that we want you to hear about right away. I was at a party this weekend, and so many people had come up to me to ask me about this incredible photograph that Richard C. Hoagland had posted on his enterprisemission.com. And lo and behold, after Friday, and Art did the program for me, I opened up my emails, and people are sending me emails on one specific topic, and that's this head on the moon. I've never received that many emails on one specific topic, and so I had to get Richard C. Hoagland back on to give us an update on this incredible story. Richard, are you getting the same kind of feedback we are here?
Yeah, and in spades, and there's an incredible, exciting discussion and debate going on over in the Enterprise Conference, which If people want to join, they just go to the Enterprise Mission website. They click on the conference at the very top. It takes them to a page. They can sign up. It's by subscription so that we keep the riffraff out, meaning people who are, very determined to kind of poke holes in anything that anyone tries to propose.
You mean the saboteurs?
Exactly. They're called trolls on the net. I think that's one term.
Yeah.
So that we have sane, interesting scientific discussions instead of name-calling. And even there, some people have crept in who I really think are paid agents, because it's like every time someone proposes a new reason why this is real, they will shoot it down with some kind of completely ad hominem attack. I'm trying to think what it was. Oh, the last one was, well, it's 250,000 miles away, and how are you ever going to know? Now, we spent billions and billions and billions of dollars, George, on the space program, right?
You got it.
We've sent space missions all over the solar system. 99.99% of the data that we acquire with tax dollars and publish in scientific journals vis-a-vis NASA, is remote sensing, meaning there isn't a chunk you can bring home and put in the laboratory. And there are all kinds of statements and conclusions and, theories that are supported based on that information. So it's a little bit disingenuous to say, well, since we don't have this thing in the lab, we'll never know what it really was. Two points. One is we don't know that it's not in a lab. I've had a lot of people say to me, do you think they actually brought it home?
They might have. They might have picked it up.
I really think, George, given the timeline and the transcript of what was going on at the Shorty Crater at that time, that they actually could have, because all it would have taken is a nylon rope attached to the rover to basically, lower a guy in a spacesuit backwards, step by step, down that gentle slope to get to it, to put it in a bag and then bring it back up again, hand over hand on a rope, because under 1/6 lunar gravity, rappelling down that slope would have been really easy if you had a rope and the rover to stabilize you.
Why is that picture appear blurry, Richard, when the Hasselblad photos that we've seen look crystal clear?
Well, because you haven't zoomed in on any particular details in the Hasselblads. When you take a normal film, picture with film, you have film grain. What we're doing, because we've got 8 separate shots of this thing, I'm in the computer very carefully superimposing the different views, one over the other, and that drives down the noise by the square root of the number of images that you can carefully superimpose one over each other. But it's very time-consuming, and I've just gotten back, and there's been a whole bunch of other stuff that's happened while I've been away. I've had to catch up on that. I'm going into the editing room tomorrow, literally, to begin editing the Joshua Tree DVDs. We're preparing actual audio for the truckers and for people who have iPods so they can download for a really small nominal fee an almost a live version of what happened during the entire Joshua Tree weekend, so they can follow all the discussions and all the confluence on 2012 and how this lunar robotic head fits into the biggest picture you can imagine. So I've been a tad busy, and I haven't had the chance to do what I love doing, which is sitting at the computer and putting this stuff together so we get the last bit of signal out of these images. But we will do that, and we will publish it, and you will see that the details you saw that almost knocked you out of your chair that night will be enhanced. I mean, to me, the most convincing thing about this, George, are the eyes.
Yeah, the irises in the eyes.
Those camera lens irises in both eyes, looking so eerily like C-3PO. I mean, that did not pop out until I superimposed 2 of these Hasselblad images that Steve Troy was able to get out of NSSDC, which is the National Space Science Data Center at Greenbelt, Maryland, at the Goddard Space Flight Center. And when I supered those in the computer and stood back and looked, bingo, those camera lenses, those iris eyes popped out, and I just said, good grief, how can anybody argue that this isn't remarkable?
You have got to get me that picture of C next to the this robot head.
Okay.
The cross picture you had.
I'm looking at it right now on the screen.
Let's get it to Tom. We'll get it to George Lucas to get his reaction
Wouldn't
to that.
Wouldn't that be cool?
I would love to do that.
Well, because of Iapetus, I have suspected for some time, because of George Lucas's connections with Joseph Campbell, that Lucas was privy to some things that the rest of us may not be? I mean, this is just too eerily close. First of all, he creates a Death Star that looks like, Iapetus, the moon of Saturn, right?
Right.
And then I find on the moon, in a place that no one would ever have imagined, except somebody who thinks beyond the edge of the paper for a living, something that looks eerily like C-3PO. Now, what are the odds? I mean, you're a guy that doesn't really believe in coincidence, George. What are the odds that a producer, even as brilliant as Lucas, could, out of the depths of his soul and his imagination, in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock, not listening to Coast, come up with this just by chance?
I know it. I'm telling you, you showed a lot of things at Joshua Tree that were mind-boggling. But when this photo came up, I tried to tear it apart. I tried to just do whatever I could. Just, not again, Richard. Here we go. No, this one is too compelling. In terms of size, would you say it's about the size of a human skull?
I can not only say that, I can prove it. And I'm going to put that up on the Enterprise website for the conference people first, because, they were a little ticked off at me that I went on your show and I put it up on the main page of Enterprise, and the whole world got to see it before
But you promised me, and you delivered.
Well, I try to keep my promises. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that analysis in the next week or so and put it up on the Enterprise conference so that the people seriously discussing the pros and cons and what could have happened. And what I'm actually hoping is that by doing this way, that we might get somebody inside NASA who knows a lot more than we know now, who basically says, okay, enough is enough here, and slips us a disk with some really cool information. Because I know that this is not the best data that exists. That's what my astronaut contact, who I sent this shot to a couple of months ago, very matter-of-factly said. I mean, I can quote verbatim from his email. He said basically, when you get better data, come back to me, which told me that better data exists.
Which Apollo 17 astronaut took the photo? Was it Cernan or Schmidt? Who did it?
I have to go back and look at the timeline. I really think it was Schmidt, and that Cernan is visible over by the rover in the same set of shots, the panorama. But don't hold me to that, because they would exchange cameras. This was at the same place where they found the orange soil, remember? And they were all excited about that, and it was part of that photographic panorama that Schmidt was taking where he saw the soil. So I'm pretty sure it was Schmidt who took the picture and Cernan who then came over and looked at the soil. But again, I'll have to go back and actually look at the timeline to make sure.
Assuming that it is Schmidt still alive, can we get him this photo?
As part of some discussions that occurred on Sunday night after you and Tom had gone to bed at Joshua Tree.
Well, why don't you rephrase that?
Well, you guys went off, to your bungalows.
All right, good. Thank you.
Just trying to keep us all honest here.
Jeez.
And the rest of us stayed up discussing this until like 4 or 5 in the morning. And one of the people in that discussion group, and I'm not going to mention names because we need to be a little delicate here to protect sources, apparently knows both Schmidt and Cernan, and volunteered in front of witnesses to get me a meeting, a quiet meeting, so I can show them this image and basically say, okay, guys, what happened? And I will have to be very circumspect. If the ground rules are that they only agree to a meeting if I don't tell anybody what happens, I will have to weigh in the balance, is it worth it? If their ground rules are that whatever they react, I can tell everybody, obviously that's the way I would prefer to go. So we're at a very delicate stage. This is real data. This could be a real breakthrough. I mean, George, I think this is the reason why President Bush suddenly, in the middle of a war, announced we're going back to the moon. All those other nations are running to the moon at warp 9. India, China,
I can't
Russia,
see you.
Japan.
I can't see you having a closed door meeting with an astronaut who was on the moon, who may have seen this, and you not come back to us and tell us what he said. Maybe Well, maybe if I read between the lines, you're going to play the game until you have to come back on this show.
No. I'm being very forthright. If I agree to something, and we will discuss ground rules ahead of time, and the ground rules are we will only discuss this with you if you do not go public at this time. Politically, if that gives me more information that I can then utilize to get further information that I can go public with, that would be a legitimate diplomatic strategy to get at the truth.
Would you tell us if the meeting even occurred then?
It would depend on what they agree, because you have to keep your agreements.
Richard, you've never held back before.
Because I've never been in the position of having very, very critical information that could basically blow the doors off. This is critical information, George. This head is real. I would bet my 25 years doing this that this head is real. And it's that important that we find out if NASA knows. I mean, to me, the worst tragedy would be not that they've got it and they're keeping it secret and we won't know, if they were able to download it, talk to it, that kind of thing. The worst tragedy would be that I show, these guys this picture and they say, "Oh my God, we never saw it."
Yes.
And they absolutely mean it. They're telling the truth. That would be an incredible tragedy because it means we wasted Apollo.
I see a vision of this on the cover, the front page of USA Today. It's got that kind of impact. Somebody had sent me an email theorizing that a past civilization, Earthbound, Marsbound, who knows, that this android, whatever it is, may have been part of something that crashed on the moon. What do you think of that?
That's a legitimate theory. We can test it. I don't think it's the real theory because, remember, this is found at 19.5 degrees, which is part of the whole NASA, symbolic landing, taking off, flying by at those key times and angles of various stars and various latitudes on various worlds. So I think that we had a good idea that there was something at the Apollo 17 landing site at Taurus Littrow before we ever went. What I didn't get to show you, because Tom was, threatening me with bodily harm if I kept you up too late.
Well, it was the 9th hour of your speech or something like that. I was going to say, if you're going to put this on iPod for truckers, most of them will be able to go from coast to coast listening to you and still not hear the whole thing.
That's right. Anyway, I have other data, other Hasselblad photography from this mission showing unmistakably evidence of extensive ruins at the Apollo 17 landing site. And I haven't had a chance to show you that data yet. When you see it, you will be as impressed as you are with this. There is a context. Remember, cases are built not on any one single piece of evidence, but on the gestalt of all the evidence. Anybody who watches CSI knows that, you don't look at one single spectral scan or one fingerprint or one blood smear. It's the totality of all the evidence. Well, we've got a lot more evidence indicating that there are ruins at Taurus Littrow, that the people running Apollo at NASA back then in 72 knew this. That's why they targeted this site, the public discussion and disclaimers notwithstanding. And so when I found this little guy, he's not that little, he's the size of you and me in terms of the head size.
Yeah.
It was like the confirmation of all the modeling and all the data we've analyzed over the years. And I was absolutely beside myself with, okay, what's the best way to bring this out in a way that impels further inside people to tell us the truth? And that's where I come back to these discussions. If someone agrees to have a one-on-one discussion to honestly discuss this, and part of the ground rules are that I can't talk about it yet, I will have to seriously weigh, will that move the entire investigation forward? And, I probably will be able to tell you if that takes place. I may not be able to tell you the results of it for the time being. I will try very hard not to be in that position where I can't talk about what we find.
I understand. And whenever that day comes, I'm telling you, it's monumental. Of everything you've looked at, including Cydonia, how would you rate this photograph?
On a scale of 1 to 10?
Yes. And let's give let's give Cydonia a 9. What would you give this, a 12?
A 12.
Yeah.
Because it comes in the context of so much other evidence which is unmistakable if you simply are objective. What I find interesting is that there are a lot of people who are looking at this who are kicking and screaming that it can't be real because I don't think emotionally they can handle what it means. That, to me, has been the major problem ever since I've been in this for the last 20-some years. I've encountered a lot of people, a la Brookings. Remember the Brookings report that said
we can't handle
the truth?
it. That's right.
There's a lot of people, George, between you, me, and Art, as we've discussed this over the years, they're not there yet. They can't handle this reality. They have been programmed that it will be so negative that we have a lot of educating to do to show them that, in fact, it's an incredible positive.
Well, you know that if an extraterrestrial robot or android was on the moon, then it was just a short 239,000-mile jaunt to good old planet Earth. You know they came the rest of the way.
Of course. And see, I have a lot of other data that I'm going to be putting together in this new book to follow on monuments, called The Heritage of Mars, Remembering Forever. And I've been waiting for the appropriate time because, as Orson Welles used to say when he was doing those Gallo wine commercials, make no wine before it's time.
Right.
There is a timing to this psychology. I think that people are more and more ready, not just because we've had a lot of cultural assist from, friends like Gene Roddenberry and Lucas and, Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick and all those incredible films. I think the physics itself, what I talked a lot about at Joshua Tree, this HD physics, which is moving us up toward 2012, that physics is impacting consciousness, a subject near and dear to your heart, and it's like people are getting more and more attuned to accept the unbelievable far more than they would have been 10, 20, or 30 or 40 years ago.
And the more I watched you and the more I listened, the more I'm beginning to understand your theory of hyperdimensional physics. Because I got to admit, when you first started talking about it, it was way over my head. I mean, I felt like I had to go back to physics and study up. And all that, of course, I trust you're going to have in this DVD available to people.
We're going in the studio tomorrow to begin editing the DVD series. We're going to put out the first one before Christmas by December 1, so people can give presents and surprise their friends and talk about what it was like to be there and what it would have been like if they had been there. And we're also going to, in the next couple days, have a live download for iPods on the website so that we'll be able to give you a link where you can, for a nominal amount, get the entire conference, listen to it. Truckers especially, they listen to you, George, day and night.
Oh, yes.
They record you, and it's very boring driving a truck. I have dear friends who drive trucks for a living, and it's incredibly boring. And if they want to, call in so they can get the
let me get this number out, Richard. Let me give it out. First of all, enterprisemission.com, and then this toll-free number, 800-900-7030. That's 1-800-900-7030. Richard, love you. Got to take this break. We'll be back.